All right, we are live. My name is Hayden Waters. We are here at the CBC and we are talking forest fires. I have a guest here with me, Mike Wotton. He is self-proclaimed, I guess you're self-proclaimed professor of fire, which is a very interesting title. You teach about forest fires at the University of Toronto. You are also a forest fire scientist with Natural Resources Canada.
Yep.
So you know a lot about forest fires. And we are taking your questions here today. So you can send in the question. We are on Facebook, we are on Periscope, we are on YouTube, and we're also streaming online. So you can ask your questions below, and Mike here will do our best to answer them.
We'll do our best.
We will do our very best. We are talking about, there's dozens of forest fires kind of blazing right now in Northern Ontario, and they have been for a little while now. So we're talking about that, but there's also forest fires happening in other parts of the world as well, in Greece, in BC. I'm wondering what's the difference between these forest fires in Northern Ontario versus forest fires in, let's say, Greece, for example.
Yeah. Probably, there's a couple of real big differences and there's a couple of similarities, really. And so, you know, let's talk about similarities. Once a fire gets spreading, it's burning through vegetation that's there, and there's vegetation, you know, in all of these places. Wherever you have vegetation, you're going to have a chance of fire. What's happening in Greece right now is very tragic. I mean, it's some of the differences between, say, Northern Ontario and that situation. I mean, they're in a real extreme heat situation, and the population density is different. It's different as well. So those fires that are burning there, you know, it's not like fires aren't threatening values in the north of Ontario, but those fires that were burning there were spreading very quickly, growing very large, and doing so in an area with a greater population density, so putting people at risk. And so, you know, that presents a real challenging situation, since under those conditions they're not going to be able to, in terms of suppression, you can't do too much once a fire gets really spreading, you know, at a very high intensity like they'd be experiencing there. Probably southern BC again, which has a number of fires going right now, is, you know, similar in that it's lightning season there, it's lightning season here in Ontario. Yeah. And we're probably all familiar, you know, with the storms that we've been seeing, you know, throughout the province, really, or throughout the country. I mean, it's just this time of year you Absolutely. Get that sort of storm, right? And but what's happened is there in southern BC, like Northern Ontario, there's been some periods without rain, and so the forest floor starts to dry out, and so those fuels where lightning fires ignite get receptive to ignition. So, you know, they're having, you know, similar. The driving forces are similar. You know, it's lightning season. Not to say that there aren't human ignitions out there as well. There's always the human factor on the landscape. But at this time of year, you're also getting big lightning storms coming through, dropping lots of lightning strikes, maybe leading to, you know, out in BC, 100 fires in a day or something like that. And that happening day after day, you know, leads to lots of fires on the landscape. And, you know, that's what we're seeing in Ontario as well.
So let's go back. You were talking about population kind of centers.
Yeah.
We've heard a lot, I guess, here in Ontario about Parry Sound 33, which is near kind of communities and population centers. Yeah. But there's much larger fires burning in Northern Ontario right now, but they're a lot more remote. What happens to those types of fires that are a lot larger? Do they just burn, or do they?
It's a good question. If they can just burn, you want them to just burn, because fire will be playing its natural role. It's got a, you know, since long before we came here, it was playing this role as a disturbance agent in the forest. It's the forest needs a good fire to go through, particularly these forests and the boreal forest in Canada that we hear about all the time. The vast forest that covers the bulk of our land needs a very intense fire to go through and regenerate that forest, essentially. So if possible, you want fire to play its natural role and burn. So you're not too concerned in an area where there aren't values, where there's not northern communities or other infrastructure that needs protecting. You want fire to burn and play its natural role, and that's one of the challenges of fire management, isn't it? Like, you're trying to you're trying to find that balance between, do I put my resources there, or do I put them, where are the values, and what do I think is going to happen on the landscape, which is so influenced by weather. And so you're trying to make predictions about what the weather is going to be in different places, and what the risks might be. And so there are a number of fires that are being left to burn. They're not completely ignored. They're monitored. So there will be reconnaissance flights on those fires. Using the fire agency may be using, say, some of the satellite, the MODIS satellite or other satellite products that are out there that can see on big scales, if it's a big fire, that can see heat, and so they may be just trying to monitor things with the situation with that, make sure that if the fire really starts spreading, you can see it in terms of smoke and in terms of some of these satellite products. But for the most part, they'll be sending out flights if they can to monitor those fires that they're letting go, so that there's no surprises coming, essentially.
There you go. We are taking your questions, so I'm not trying to be rude, but looking down every once in a while to see your questions. You can ask them below. We do have one here from Stephanie Carlton, who asks, how hot are the forest fires? She asked that on CBC Sudbury's Facebook page.
Oh, okay. That's a good question. That's interesting. That's part of my research is measuring exactly that. So, the how to best describe that? A flame is about 1,000 degrees Celsius, essentially. So in its thickest, and even a flame, anything from a 2-meter flame to a 20 or 30-meter flame, pretty much saturates at that temperature. So about 1,000, 1,100 degrees Celsius is the temperature you get to there. A tip of a flame is typically more like 300 or 400.
Okay, excellent. I'm also wondering, we have a question here from Pamela J. Holm, also CBC Sudbury's Facebook page. Do forest fires reduce or help to manage diseases in trees like Dutch elm disease, etc.?
Okay. A good example would be, say, fire will, a good intense fire, I don't want to call it a nice intense fire, but a good high intensity fire that goes through and will kill live trees and heat up to 1,000 degrees, as we just talked about. That plant material on the at least in the outer edges of the bark and of the tree, it can kill and sterilize organisms that aren't embedded deep within the tree. The heat doesn't penetrate, even though you may kill the tree. The heat isn't penetrating all the way into the bark. What fire can do, though, if we talk about disease and insects, and up in around Sudbury, between Sudbury and North Bay, there was an outbreak of spruce budworm happening over the last, say, I think it's been growing for 20 years. But so that's killing certain types of trees, and what fire will do is it will burn very readily in that in those trees that have been killed and are starting to dry out, and that'll lead to really intense fire. So it's a problem for control, but it will also clean up that stand and help it to regenerate.
All right, excellent. We have a question here from Juan Burnell off of the CBC Toronto Facebook page. What's the principal cause of a forest fire?
In Canada, it's about 50-50. Humans are causing half of the fires. Lightning is causing half of the fires. But that varies seasonally, right? Like I talked earlier on about we're in the middle of lightning season here, and that we get lightning lots of the year. But essentially, in the middle of summer, when we're in the heat of the summer and the atmosphere is really warm, we got these days down here in Toronto where it's really humid and hot. You tend to get a lot more storm buildup because there's moisture in the atmosphere and there's heat in the atmosphere, and so you get a lot more lightning in July and August. And so we call this lightning season, essentially, or lightning fire season. So in the spring, the atmosphere is cooler. Lightning can happen from storms, but there's not at all as much. So in the spring, fires are mainly dominated by human causes. Over the entirety of the snow-free season, though, in Canada it's about 50-50. In other places around the world, there's much more of a human dominance of fire. and that's fairly common in many places.
And we've been talking about this dry lightning, which I've been talking to the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry a lot over the last few days, and they said this dry lightning, where it's lightning with little rain or no rain, has been causing them issues. Maybe you want to kind of expand on that for someone who hasn't heard that kind of thing.
Sure.
Before.
Yeah. And so, you associate lightning with storms and with rain typically. But if the atmosphere has been very dry, that rain that's falling can evaporate before it hits the ground, and so you have a situation where a storm is rolling through, dropping lightning, but not really having rain hit the ground. And this is far more common out west, where atmosphere is typically a lot drier. Right? Yes. In these, down here in southern Ontario, where we're in the middle of hot and really really wet weather in terms of the humidity, we wouldn't get too much dry lightning here, but elsewhere where the air mass is a bit drier, you could have this. So the thing about lightning is, so it can hit a tree, and if the fuel's on the ground, if the material on the ground that it's going to spread in is nice and dry, that fire could start immediately and start spreading. But the other side of lightning is that a storm can come through that actually does drop a bit of rain and wet the surface fuel, so that you're not expecting there to be a spreading fire. The conditions just aren't great for a fire to spread. So then you may think that, oh, okay, I'm good for that storm, right? But lightning can, as it comes to electrical ground through a tree, what it tends to do here in this part of the world, anyways, is ignite the forest floor. So that decaying organic material that sometimes that builds up in many of our forests, and so it can sustain itself down underneath the surface of the forest floor that might have got wet. It can sustain itself for days down there, and so it can smolder away until the conditions become right at the surface, until it dries out, until the wind picks up, and then that fire can all of a sudden pop up and start spreading. So if you the MNR currently would watch storms go through, and they have their lightning detectors tracking where the lightning is, and but they would be worrying about those storms for the next several days, and they'd be watching, well, how many fires started to come up from that storm today, and if there was some, well, we may still expect some tomorrow and the next day. So any single storm is an ongoing source potentially of ignitions out there.
And the MNR, if we say it a few times, it's the Ministry of Natural Resources.
Yeah.
We use the lingo a little bit.
Yeah. We're terrible in the fire business that way. We have these acronyms for everything, and so we're talking about the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry.
I've got a question here from Melanie. How do forest fires affect wildlife? And it's a multi-part question. Is wildlife deaths due to fires high, or is wildlife smart enough to escape?
I think for the most part, wildlife is smart enough to escape. And there could be situations where fast-moving fire, can encircle areas and trap wildlife, but for the most part, I think wildfire or wildlife can typically move out in advance of a fire. Not to say that there isn't mortality from wildfires. I've never seen a survey of those numbers, though. It certainly happens, particularly with big complex fires on a landscape, like I say, where an area might burn, another area might burn, and those fire lines might join together. Yeah. I mean, fires can be very complex that way, and so that could cut off an area of escape. Certainly on the experimental fires that I've done, and as part of my research, we do large experimental fires, typically with a fire agency like the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources. But you will occasionally see squirrels running off, or sort of an outflux of insects coming off of the fire. I spent some time on fires in Australia, and this was really the case. You'd turn around and you'd have insects sort of, climbing on you, or a big lizard run out past you, or something like that. Yeah. And they can tend to escape. Other other wildlife that say has burrows in the ground. You could go, they could go into their burrow and if the conditions are right, survive in there because the heat doesn't penetrate too far down into the ground. So you'd have to be able to, it would depend on how the ventilation was, that sort of stuff. But you might be able, a ground dwelling wildlife might be able to survive as well. But I don't know any. I haven't read any real good science that summarizes up those numbers. That's interesting.
My guest right now is Mike Wotton. We are taking questions about forest fires, the forest fires in Northern Ontario, the forest fires in other parts of the country and the world. I've got a question here from Don Crab, who's watching on CBC News' YouTube account. He asks, what is the carbon footprint of a fire compared to something humans do, such as diesel trucks and trains or gas-fired electrical generation? Are these fires beating us at carbon pollution? That might be a little tricky.
It's a complex question, but a very relevant one.
Yes.
It depends on the fire. There's some numbers that we did in a study from a study a few years ago where we looked at all of the fires that were burning in Canada. And let's talk about Canada as a whole. Just so all of the fires that are burning in Canada, on average, we get about there's about 2 million hectares of fire. Area burned in Canada, let's say, so 2.5, we looked at from the models that we have developed in terms of what's being consumed directly in the passage of a fire. We could estimate the amount of carbon that was directly being emitted from all of those wildfires. It's admittedly an estimate, and there's lots of uncertainty around it. But my memory is that number was somewhere around, and we compared it. To have something to compare it to that folks could wrap their heads around, we compared it to the total emissions from human activity. So we would call them total anthropogenic emissions of carbon from fossil fuel burning and that sort of thing. So, and it was about 20% or so. Okay. The carbon emissions, 25% the carbon emissions from wildfire. Yeah. Some years, so area burned every year varies a lot. And so some years those emissions could rival and be somewhat equivalent to our anthropogenic emissions on a really extreme bad year. Yeah. There's a big wild card in that as well, and we saw that if folks can remember back to the late it was the late 90s and the El Nino that was happening at that time, and there was a massive amount of peat burning in Indonesia, and that really sort of woke a lot of people up. I mean, there were many scientists who had been interested in the consumption of big deep peat layers prior to that, and were warning about it as a problem. But that really woke up the world to there's a massive amount of carbon there, and so those fires. Indonesia isn't a massive place by any means, but those fires had a massive carbon impact. And throughout the north of Canada, we have a lot of peatland as well. And so one of the big wild cards in that number that I gave you doesn't include any sort of peatland burning, deeper burning. We talked about the fires in Yellowknife earlier as we were coming over here in 2014, and those fires burned in peatland areas for throughout a good chunk of the summer, throwing up lots of smoke and nasty particulate matter that affected a number of communities. So again, that's a wild card in our estimates of emissions, but a complicated question. Hopefully I did that.
You did it justice, I would say. We have another question here from YouTube. The question is, why are and were the Greek wildfires so devastating? I would hesitate to speculate, since that's so fresh and in the news right this week. I think it's the fuels on those fuels in those Mediterranean type climates can be quite volatile. You have a shrubby fuel. It's not exactly the same as, say, that Southern California shrubby type that they get that can have very rapid spreading fire in, but it's you have a very volatile fuel there in combination with really hot
hot and dry weather, and that those led to some uncontrollable fires, in a terrible place at the wrong time, and where they were intersecting with people, living, and so it's I mean, I would hate to, I can't answer that one with any degree of depth here. We'll find out over the next several months, as that the depth of that tragedy unfolds. But last year, there were similar tragic deaths in Portugal as well, and I think if I remember right, early in the year in Chile as well, and later in the year in California as well. And it's a combination of very hot and windy weather, and volatile fuels, and population density, where you're trying to escape an area, but the fires are moving very, very quickly.
Of course, we're taking questions here on Facebook and YouTube and Periscope, so you can send yours in below. We have a little bit more time left. One of the questions we got also on CBC Sudbury's Facebook page was, what is it like to fight a forest fire? And I don't know if that's something you've done. You've been out in the field, but maybe you can...
It's as a researcher, I spend a lot of time looking at forest fires. And like I said, we have experimental programs where a lot of the modeling that I do in terms of trying to build predictive tools for fire agencies to use to help predict what might happen to on a particular fire. We do that through experimental burning. So we sit and watch fires. I don't fight fires myself.
Do you have a chair that you just sit, or do you stand there, or how does that work?
We set out these areas. We go out to an area. We chunk out a chunk of the forest. That's pretty. We're doing this in a as scientific a way as we can, and trying to treat the forest as our lab. And so you try to choose a nice uniform bit of forest, and you create a block that you might burn. Work with say the Ministry of Natural Resources to help you ignite and suppress that fire, and we would put all kinds of instrumentation out. The reason I liked the temperature question earlier is I put out thermocouples throughout these things, so I measure the temperature in these fires at all kinds of different heights and different locations, and we might measure the wind flow or the amount of energy, radiant energy coming off that fire. So we instrument them, and then when we watch them burn, and it's a really great way to see this process. This process is very very chaotic. You have lots of energy coming off this fire, but also lots of wind, creating all kinds of turbulence, and so it's a process that's hard as a physicist. It's hard to describe in a nice uniform way, but it's very you need to see it to understand it. And so I've spent my career trying to watch experimental fires. So I can't say I know what it's like to put out a fire.
But you have experience watching them.
I hope that that's the value added that I bring. Absolutely. Is that if you're focusing on putting out that fire, you don't have time to sit and think about that as a scientist. You have a luxury as a scientist to sit back and watch that fire move along, and you're not worried, is it going to breach this line, or am I do I need to move my hose line down here? You're sort of being very it's a luxury to be able to watch and to sit there and think. So
we have a question from Chris Prowse on YouTube. He says, are the frequency of fires increasing or decreasing at the moment in Ontario? And historically speaking, what do you project for August?
Yeah, okay.
I know we were talking, I've been talking to the Ministry of Natural Resources here in Ontario, numbers-wise, and they've had more than 800 fires in Ontario this summer so far, and that's well above average.
Right.
So I know from a numbers-wise, this summer is well above average, but we were talking earlier about saying it's not like entirely out of reach that this would be.
That's right. It's not beyond the realm of normality, and so averages are deceiving, particularly in this fire world where it is you can have really quiet seasons, and then you can have really busy seasons, and so we are say 3 or 4 times the average. I can't remember where the numbers are sitting today, but 3 or 4 times the average numbers in terms of numbers of fires, but that's not outside the say what's been observed over the last say 30 years. That you need to think about things on a longer scale like that to really interpret how far you are outside of the normal. In terms of trends, it's complicated to say, to answer that question. Just are we seeing more fires? Are we seeing less fires? One of the things I do in my research is we look at, well, what might the future look like? What kind of weather are we expecting? Not in August, but over the next decade and the decade after that, and just with a range of different potential climate change scenarios. And there we do expect that over time the numbers of fires that we're seeing on the landscape is going to go up, simply because the fuels on the landscape, the vegetation on the landscape, the dry vegetation that fire spreads in, that starts and spreads in, is getting drier because it's it gets dry if it's a bit warmer. So whether we're seeing more fires in Ontario than we did, say, a decade or 2 decades ago, it's hard to say with certainty, because these seasons are so variable from year to year, and also things change, and you start looking for fires, and what's the best way to describe this? Through time, the numbers that you're recording can change as well in some cases. So you can make an agreement. A province can make an agreement with a municipality that they're going to fight fires in this area. The municipality is going to fight fires in this area, and the province is going to come and fight fires over here now. And there's all kinds of complicating factors that make that a really hard question to answer. For August, well, we're almost in August, so
the fires aren't stopping anytime soon.
That's
right?
the thing, and if we look at again, we're like we were talking about earlier, we're in the middle of lightning season, and the forest floor currently is still, even though we've had some rain through the province, there are still pieces of both the northeast and the northwest of Ontario where there is the potential for lightning ignition. And like we talked about earlier, a little bit of rain can wet that surface of that can stop fire from spreading, but it also then that moisture doesn't penetrate down into the ground to lower that potential for ignition from lightning, so that you need more rainfall essentially. So we could, in a week's time, we could get rain throughout the, big wetting rain on the order of 20, 30, 40 millimeters of rain that would wet the forest floor and would reduce that lightning ignition. But given that there are still, a few lightning ignitions, coming up, there's still the potential for ignition there. But, if there's, and you can, so the Ministry of Natural Resources would be looking at indicators they have of what the moisture levels are in that area of the forest floor that is really receptive to ignition. They estimate that all across the province, and so they'd be looking at those and getting a sense of whether are we going to still be are we currently in a period where we have a lot of lightning ignition potential or not. You can never tell how much lightning you're going to get. Are the storms going to track through here?
That's connected to Renee on Facebook. Asks, is there a specific site that you can track where lightning strikes are happening around Ontario?
A specific public website,
yeah,
are we talking about?
Yeah.
You can look at, so if you were to look up, if you were, say, to go onto some search engine like Google, and can we advertise for Google? I don't know whether we can. If you're gonna go on a search engine and type, say, lightning map Canada, you would find a bunch of different links there.
Yeah.
And so you would find Environment Canada's link. Environment Canada has a real-time, they operate a lightning detection network for all of Canada. And so they will show you where strikes are happening throughout the country in real time. It's nice. There's there's a.
And can you zoom down? She's wondering if she can see in particular area exactly what's going to happen.
That's more challenging. You can zoom. If I remember right, you can zoom in on that Environment Canada map a bit, but it's a little bit challenging. I mean, these lightning detection networks are, my sense, and one of the things I do is from a research point of view, I use lightning and I model what's the probability of getting lightning fires happening. So I'm quite interested in lightning and it's the accuracy of the locator networks. And I find there maybe plus or minus a kilometer or two. So you can't drill down and see whether that lightning was in your backyard or something like that. But you can get a general area, a general idea of where that lightning is. You can drill into those maps a little bit. The weather network also has a map like that. There's a really interesting global lightning site out there as well. Again, and you'll see it if you do that web search. It'll be another one that pops up. But it's a global, it's a crowdsourced lightning site as well, where people put these detectors and so it does a good job in say about half of Ontario as well. But you can't. With most of those sites, you can't drill in too far, but you can drill into the southern Ontario area and have a look at where the storms are coming through and see the strikes happening in pretty much real time, maybe with a lag of a second or two, essentially. So,
excellent.
Yeah.
I'm going to close out here on a comment. That's all the time we have for today. But the comment is from Di, who is thanking all the firefighters out and about in northern and southern Ontario and all who came to help out. So there's people from Mexico that came, firefighters. So I think that's a good place to end it. Of course, you can follow the latest updates on the forest fires. CBC is running a live blog that you can see at cbc.ca/Sudbury for the latest updates on the forest fires. And I'd like to thank our guest for being here, Mike Wotton, who is with the Natural Resources Canada, forest fire scientist there, and also you are a professor, teach at the University of Toronto. So thank you, Mike, for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for answering some questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's all for today.
Thanks.
Thank you for tuning in.